Hello, Secular Student Alliance. I'm excited to talk to you all specifically. Hello, Secular Student Alliance. As a young activist who cares deeply about atheism and church-state separation and pushing back against Christian nationalism and everything else that entails. Just to give you some background, I started an SSA group in college. I was on the board of the National Secular Student Alliance. I was the chair of the board for a few years, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you I would not be doing any of the work I'm doing today if not for the support I got from the SSA. So this is a cause that I've been fighting for nearly half my life now. I genuinely appreciate the fact that you would take time to be here and watch this, and I hope in the future we can do this sort of thing in person again soon. So the topic for this conference is envisioning a better world. And when I heard that, I thought there's an obvious way to do it. And the weird thing is that I don't think I've ever heard anyone make a case for it at any other atheist conference or event I've ever been to. So I'm gonna do it here. In fact, I'm gonna just give away the ending of this speech and tell you what I hope you take away from it. You might laugh, but I'm not joking. And I'm directing this specifically to the high school and college students who are watching. I want you to finish this video with a question in your head. Which office am I going to run for a year from now? I don't care if your answer is school board or city council or student body president or state legislature or even Congress. By the way, for all of those except Congress, you usually only have to be 18 years old to run. Congress is 25. And I don't care if you already have a career plan, because I'm not asking you to abandon it. Outside of Congress, this is not an either-or situation. You can do both. But I want you to identify an office and seriously look into the steps necessary to work towards it. Because getting in office is doable if you know what you're doing, and if you're passionate about the cause, and if you figure out how to address any weaknesses you might have. It's kind of like running an SSA group. And I would also point out that a lot of the people who end up running for office don't know how to do any of these things. Now, let me back up and talk about why that's a goal you should aim for. Something that frustrates me to no end is that when I think about the worst people in public office, and I'm going to do my best to keep this a nonpartisan speech because the SSA is a nonpartisan group, and I know we're all aware of Congress members who might annoy us because they get a lot of coverage, but when it comes to state-level candidates or city officials, the ones who have a more direct impact on your life and happen to be really bad at what they do, a lot of times they run unopposed. Do you know how many elected offices there are in the United States? You think Congress, that's 535 people right there. There are governors and state representatives. So what's the total across the country? Several thousand? Maybe 10,000? 20,000 maximum, right? Actually, by one estimate, the actual number is more than 519,000. More than 500,000 elected officials in the country. Almost all of them are local government officials, and a lot of those seats only have one person interested. We shouldn't have to settle for our elected officials. A lot of times, even if there is a challenger, the incumbent wins because there's no real effort in a campaign, and it feels like no one's even paying attention. Sometimes I wonder if the people running care about their races. So why do they do it, even though they're bad at it? Everyone has their own reasons, but one reason that shouldn't be ignored is that whatever you think about their politics, they feel obligated to run because it's part of a larger cause for them. For example, they may be Christian activists who believe the best way to honor God is by pushing for pro-Christian laws through the government. I remember for years before Trump was in office, there was a group called the American Renewal Project. And it would get huge headlines every couple of years because the guy running it was making this bold claim of what he wanted to accomplish. He wanted 1,000 pastors to run for elected office. At one point, he said he had over 500 who committed to running for something within a few years. I'm not sure how that panned out, but that is what he said. And why was this so important for David Lane, the guy who ran it? I'm going to paraphrase this, but he basically said, if you had 1,000 candidates who had about 300 volunteers apiece, that meant 300,000 Christians getting involved in politics, some of whom would later go on to run for office themselves. And that would lead to a kind of Christian nationalist revolution that he wanted to see. And how would he define success? I mean, if 10% of the people who ran won their races, we're talking 100 conservative Christian pastors in office. That's not nothing. That creates change. The question is, what kind? I disagree with just about everything that guy believes politically. And I'm happy to say his group kind of faded away in recent years. But in terms of getting his side excited and involved, that's pretty amazing. Why aren't we doing that when our ideas are so much better? I know atheists are not monolithic, but most atheists share values in a lot of important areas. More on that in a bit. So going back to those really bad public officials, in local government especially, why do you think they run unopposed so often or without a real challenger? Maybe because they live in a heavily conservative or heavily liberal district, and it seems all but impossible to unseat them. But I would also argue it's because a lot of the smartest, youngest, most media-savvy, thoughtful policy wonks out there also tend to have the most self-doubt. It feels like it's always the mediocre or bad people who are so confident they would be good at everything they do, including politics, while the smartest people I've ever met are the kinds of people who think they shouldn't run because they're not perfect candidates, or they don't know everything, or they don't come from a political family, or they don't have a lot of money, or they don't like the idea of asking for money or publicly criticizing someone else's positions. But that cycle keeps perpetuating itself. Without good people in government, we won't have a good government, which discourages good people from wanting to go into government. But how many of you marched in a protest over the past few years? Maybe it was after the murder of George Floyd. Maybe it was the Women's March in 2017, or the March for Science, or for any cause that matters to you. Clearly you care, but all that marching is only meaningful if it translates into action. I've seen this in recent weeks when city councils say we're changing up how much money the police department gets and reinvesting it in our communities in other ways. That's a result of the protests. But that only happens when you have people in elected office who can vote on those decisions. So if you care, then marching is nice, but running for office is better. A number of candidates who ran in 2018 said they decided to go for it because of the Women's March in 2017. I've personally been inspired by a number of people who have run for office in the past few years who seem to come out of nowhere, but they have this passion for public service and an understanding of media and the ability to cut through the BS and the ability to just speak honestly to voters. Now, I know I'm speaking to you, a lot of young atheists, and not, future politicians of America. I'm aware of that. And this is not a speech I would make to them. I'm making it to you for a reason. And one big reason is that I never heard anyone give this type of speech to me when I was in your shoes. Because being an open atheist, running for office would have been a non-starter. That's changing. I'll tell you how in a bit. But another big reason, I don't think anyone ever told me I should even consider running for office when I was in my teens or 20s. Even now in my late 30s, no one's seriously saying that. And that's stupid. If you take this stuff seriously, you should be thinking about it in high school and college. So I'm coming into this thinking, assuming, you probably care a lot about science, sex education, critical thinking, evidence-based policies, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, healthcare, student loans, and yes, atheism. If you want to say in how we deal with those issues, we've spent way too long as a movement complaining from the sidelines and watching the world burn. And I want you to take a direct role in changing that. Let's start with the last thing I mentioned, atheism, because this is where I'm going to get a bit selfish. Because as much as I want people who agree with me on the issues to run for office, there's also some strategy behind it. This may sound like a tangent, but I promise I'll loop back around in a bit. Here's a pop quiz for you. Name the most famous atheists you can think of. Someone your non-atheist friends would also know. So, sorry, bloggers and YouTubers, you don't count. Do a couple of names come to mind already? And while you think about that, I'll ask you this. How important is it to have any atheists in office at all? Because the fact is, we don't actually need atheists in government. I don't need someone in Washington or a state capitol doing the work of atheist activists. And there are really good religious people in office who support church-state separation and all the other values I care about too. I'm happy to vote for them. I've done it in every election. But I would argue that symbolism matters. It matters when people see a Muslim congresswoman or a transgender state rep or a bisexual senator in ways that go so far beyond mere identity politics. You see them, and maybe you see a little bit of yourself in them, and maybe you think, I could do that. This thing that I thought would hold me back doesn't have to. How many of you have told someone you're an atheist only to have them say, oh, but I thought you were a good person? And that happens because for the longest time, the only atheists other people got exposed to were the ones who had a goal of trashing religion. I'm not saying that's even bad, only that that's a fact. For example, think about stand-up comedy. When you see a comedian on stage who is open about being an atheist, they're making jokes about religion. Bill Maher is not winning the hearts and minds of devout Christians because that's not his goal. George Carlin wanted to point out religious hypocrisy, and that might be okay, but realize those are well-known atheists, some of the first people who come to mind when other people think of atheists. Or maybe they think of famous atheist authors like Richard Dawkins. But again, in his book, The God Delusion, his goal, he says, is to convince you you're wrong about religion. And again, that's fine. I appreciate that. But it's also easy for religious people to demonize him because of that. So are there any famous atheists who don't rub religious people the wrong way? Honestly, I'm steeped in this world, and it's hard for me to think of any. And maybe that's because I don't think there's a nice way to tell people, even subtly, that they've devoted their lives to a lie. But that's my point. How many atheists can you think of who are open about it and talk about it, but who are not in the business of promoting it? I don't think there are that many. Some actors and athletes might bring it up in interviews, but it's usually very brief and it's not that substantive. Even Daniel Radcliffe, who's talked about atheism more than most other actors, is still known for his acting, not his religious views. A few months ago, the Pew Research Center published the results of a survey they did, in which they asked people, who's the first person who comes to mind when you think of atheism? 51% couldn't name anybody. 26% named some random people, including Bill Maher, Stephen Hawking, Obama, who was not an atheist, and Jesus for some reason. 10% mentioned somebody they knew personally, but actual famous names, there was a top 3. You ready for this? Number 3, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the founder of American Atheists, someone who helped take forced prayer out of public school, someone who's long been a boogeyman for the religious right, who was also subsequently murdered. There was a Netflix movie about her a couple of years ago. That name makes sense, but she's been dead take forced prayer out of public school. Someone who's long been a boogeyman. O'Hair, Obama, who was not an atheist, and Jesus for some reason. 10% mentioned somebody they knew personally, but actual famous names, there was a top 3. You ready for this? Number 3, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the founder of American Atheists, someone who helped take forced prayer out of public school, someone who's long been a boogeyman for the religious right, who was also subsequently murdered. There was a Netflix movie about her a couple of years ago. That name makes sense, but she's been dead for more than 25 years. Number 2 on the list, Richard Dawkins. I think that one is self-explanatory. The number 1 name on the list, Satan. No joke. So what's my point? I'm just saying we don't have a great image, and I wish we did. It would be so nice if there were famous atheists known outside of our bubble who also didn't make a lot of people cringe. But good luck finding that. And now we're full circle. This is where running for office can actually help us. This is where it's strategic. This is why getting elected means not just better government, but more visibility for atheism than any other job, even if an atheist happens to be the leader. Because in theory, when you are in government, you're fighting for everyone. That's your job. It's perhaps the highest profile place you could find an atheist who's open about being an atheist, but whose job is not advocating for atheism. It may be the best opportunity we have to show people respectable atheists in public life, in a place where their job is not to denigrate religion. And that goes such a long way to changing the perception that we can't be good people. I'm not saying that's the reason you should run for office, but if you care about the image of atheists and destigmatizing atheism, it's a damn good reason. Don't ignore it. I'm telling you this as someone who grew up thinking atheism was synonymous with bad. And even later when I became an atheist, I thought it was a deal breaker for political candidates. After all, there are more than half a dozen states whose constitutions still say you have to believe in a higher power in order to run for office. None of those laws are enforceable, but the fact that they exist at all tells you what people used to think about atheism, and in some cases still do. But I'm telling you, that's not true anymore, and it's really not true for younger people. Let's talk about that for a bit. The granddaddy of polling here, the one that gets cited everywhere, is a Gallup poll that asks people if they would consider voting for a blank person for president if that person belonged to your party. You know, all other things considered, would you vote for a woman, a black person, a gay person? And every category has seen a rise over the years. Regardless of party, it seems like most people today don't really care about a candidate's gender or race. They don't care if you're Jewish or Hispanic. It's getting to the point where they don't really care if you're gay. And that's true even among Republicans. I mean, it's less true among Republicans, but it's changing. So they did this poll again in January, and the results were just shocking. Not only did a record 60% of Americans say they would be fine voting for an atheist, all other things considered, when they broke it down by age, 77% of people ages 18 to 34 said atheism would not be an issue for them. In 1958, that number was 18% support. In 2007, it was 45%. The growth there in such a relatively short time is amazing. We're at the point where we've gone from virtually unelectable to not even that special. And that's awesome. That means atheism is less of a deal breaker than we thought. And again, that question is only about voting for a president, which is an office where we tend to know the candidate's entire life stories. You think anyone cares about your religion when you're running for state rep? Hardly. You think they care about your theology if you're running for city council? Not a chance. No one even knows who's on the ballot for city council. True story. I try really hard to keep track of openly non-religious people in public office. And as of 2018, there are about 50 of them across the country in office at the state level or higher. No Republicans on that list. Well, a couple of months ago, I found out that there may, in fact, be an atheist Republican on a city council. So I called her up. We spoke about it. And she basically said neither one of those labels really mattered to voters. She didn't run as an atheist or a Republican. She ran as herself. And because city councils almost never deal with culture war issues, they don't even necessarily deal with Trump, they're dealing with, local businesses and roads and schools and police. So two labels that might provoke a reaction online didn't really affect her at all. One more story. I actually spoke to a candidate for state office a couple of weeks ago who was open about her atheism when running. At least it was in one of her bios. And I was telling her I was pretty surprised she was open about it. And she seemed shocked. She didn't understand why that would be an issue for anyone. I was telling her, well, there just aren't that many elected officials who are open atheists. And again, she was surprised. It didn't affect her campaign at all up to that point. And I think I was the first person who even asked her about it. The point is, most people, I would think, can't name the people on their city council. And they don't know their state representatives. But that also means they almost certainly wouldn't be able to tell me about their religious beliefs, because they rarely come up in those elections. Those elections are far less about money and biography and much more about hustle. Are you campaigning door to door? Are you talking about the issues that people actually care about? Can you get enough people to vote for you? Can you get enough people to vote, period? Because relatively few people vote in those elections. So if you happen to be open about your atheism, But you're running for office where that doesn't even matter. It's a win-win. We get an intelligent person, hopefully, in office, and we get an atheist who brings a brand new face to the ideology. Let me give you my favorite example of this from a few years ago. Megan Hunt. She's from Nebraska, which, if you remember from your government classes, is the one state that only has state senators. Everyone's a senator, there's no house, it's unicameral, not bicameral. So she was a first-time candidate running against another first-time candidate for that seat. And a local newspaper ran profiles of both women. And Megan's included a little sidebar biography that included a spot for her to list her religion. It said atheist. And I remember seeing that and thinking, oh no, she's gonna lose. And then you know what happened? Nothing. It never came up. And maybe more importantly, she never really talked about it while campaigning. She was prepared. I mean, if people asked, she said she would answer it honestly, but then pivot to issues that mattered. But no one did. And then she won the race. She is now State Senator Megan Hunt. And she's been one hell of an amazing force in that Senate. I'm a very cynical person, especially about politics, but when I see her fight for issues that matter to her, I swear, it's inspirational. I've never seen someone in politics whose positions I identify with so closely. I asked her once, how was your atheism not a problem in your race? It's Nebraska. It's rural in a lot of parts. It's very conservative. And she told me she just took the air out of the balloon. She brought it up before any opponent could bring it up. And that allowed her to talk about what actually mattered to voters. She was genuine. She didn't hide who she was, and she talked to people about what she hoped to do for them in office, which turned out to be what they cared about, because her atheist values, even if she didn't spell it out, aligned with their religious values. So here's another question. What does it take for open atheists to win elections? What if your atheism is central to your identity? Is that a problem? Well, this is why it's so important that you think about running for office now, because it is a long-term proposition. I think, based on everything I've seen over the years, if your atheism is the only thing people know about you, yes, it might be political poison. But if it's one of many things people know about you, and you're not the one talking about it, it's really not that big of a deal. And consider what Senator Hunt is able to do as a progressive legislator, even in a conservative state. She's able to use her platform to advocate for sensible policies that she would otherwise be fighting for from the sidelines. So many of us will donate to nonprofits that work on issues we care about. We may try to get internships with them or volunteer for them. I did that. We love reading about a lawsuit from the Freedom from Religion Foundation or the American Humanist Association. Or we enjoy watching a clapback on Twitter from a writer we admire. But what's better than that is being in a position to write the laws instead of having to constantly play defense and complain about other people who are writing laws. Because that's what our movement has been doing for decades. We complain because what other option do we have? For 20 years now, I've listened to talks about legal challenges and how to fight back against the religious right. Rarely have people talked about how to play offense. Conservative Christian politicians will try to change the rules to have Bible readings in schools, or to give churches taxpayer money, or to put up a useless Ten Commandments monument outside the state capitol. And we always have to use the courts to fight back because there aren't enough of us in the room where it happens to just stop the problems from happening in the first place, or at least to raise awareness of what other politicians are doing. Even at the city council level, where you're not writing laws, we can push back against invocation rituals while also helping our city with whatever local issues there are. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to know how to reach out to experts when needed. Or what if you run for school board? You can help craft curriculum decisions. You can make sure kids are getting a quality science education and learning comprehensive sex ed. And yes, maybe you can help end the Pledge of Allegiance ritual, depending on your state laws, while also creating an environment that enriches students. We often hear little kids saying, "I want to grow up to be president." No child ever says, "I can't wait to run for city council. I can't wait to get on the school board." They should. We would all be better off if they did. And this is why we need more people like you in office. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, I'm full of it. Nice ideas, but not for you, because you are young and you've already plotted out your career path. You want to go into education or law or medicine or business, all of which are very demanding. Or maybe you have a baby or a partner who rightly requires your attention. Those things take up time. How can you possibly run for anything when you're swamped by life? But I'm telling you, that's exactly why you should run. I don't want people in office whose entire life is about getting into office. Imagine what Congress would be like if there were more young mothers or people who have student loan debt or who have PhDs or spent years as a public school teacher or used to be a bartender. We need those voices. Your backgrounds are the very things that should make you want to be a public servant. If you want to go into medicine because you want to help patients, that's great. But what would also help them is someone pushing for universal health care and affordable medicine. Be in a position where you can guide health policy. I love teachers. I was a teacher, but I wish we had more public school teachers in office because they have a better understanding of what students need and they can advocate for that. There's a famous saying, if you want to get something done, ask a busy person. Well, I know you're all busy. I also know that if you're part of an SSA group or leading an SSA group, you know how to get stuff done. And if you're running an atheist group, you know how to get stuff done while working with people who probably annoy the hell out of you. Literally. Just consider this. And I'll use Dawkins only because he's well known, not because I'm a fan of everything he says. Dawkins was a scientist, and then he became a scientist who wrote books about science that were very popular. His skill was science communication. And what did he do with that? He used that platform to write arguably the best-selling atheist book of all time. All of you already have a platform. And if you're going into some career, you will have that platform. I want you to use that as a launching pad to do something bigger than yourself, because that is what the Christian right does. And as much as I hate to admit it, they're really good at it. They can't produce a decent movie worth a damn, but they get themselves elected up and down the board. And I would argue that's made our country a poorer place for so many people. Now, I know it's daunting to think about running for any office. It's also very easy to raise self-doubts. But all of you who care about these issues are probably more qualified to run for nearly every office I've been talking about. And what's the worst that could happen? You lose. It's okay. It's not the end of the world, I promise you. Most people who run for office lose. But you know what? Many people who win an election have lost previous races. When they lose, they learn from it, fix any mistakes, and they win the next time. Near where I live, a candidate named Marie Newman ran for Congress in 2018 as a Democrat, trying to unseat a very conservative Democrat in the primary. She lost by a couple of points. So what did she do? She decided she would try again and figure out where in her district she wasn't connecting with people. And then she worked her butt off, making sure she had volunteers on the ground in those areas specifically, and made sure she was addressing their needs. And when Illinois held our primary this past March, she beat the guy in the primary by a few points. That's how you do it. A lot of groups that teach people how to run for office tell you to plan to run in multiple cycles because it's not easy to win, certainly not your first time. By the way, almost all of those positions, school board, city council, even state office in many states, are side jobs. They're not full-time. They expect you to have a life and a career and also do this other work. Senator Megan Hunt, who I mentioned earlier, is in a job that pays $12,000 a year. It's not a job to be a state senator. It's a privilege that basically pays some rent in return. But if you take that honor seriously and you're good at it, imagine what you could do with that power. Okay, so if you are interested, you should visit a couple of websites that may be helpful. These are not the only ones by any means, but they will help you get started. Runforoffice.org will tell you what positions are open in your zip code and when you have to file the paperwork to run. Runforsomething.net will give you step-by-step instructions on how to run a campaign if you're a young progressive candidate, which I'm guessing many of you are. And if you're a woman, may I suggest getherelected.com, which hooks candidates up with volunteers who are eager to help out with all sorts of things. I personally spent some time as a public speaking coach to one candidate a couple of years ago who ran for pretty high office. So, just to summarize, I want you to run for office because as atheists, odds are we share many of the same values. And we need your voices all across the board. I want you to run because having atheists in prominent positions that are not all about promoting atheism will actually make it easier for people to adopt that label. It's a win-win. We get good officials and you make my job as an activist a little easier. As SSA leaders, you are already role models for other young atheists. But as elected officials, you could be role models for everyone. And listen, no one will ever tell you to run for office. Indian parents will never tell you to run for office. It needs to be something you decide for yourself. But consider this a nudge from me. Just consider it. You're part of this incredible large network of supporters who are rooting for your success. And if you do run, and I happen to share your values, I promise you I will do whatever I can to support you. Good luck.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hemant, for that excellent presentation. I was getting pinged left and right how inspired people were.
Oh, good.
Some people already saying they want to run for office. So
good.
You've done well. You've done well. Good to see you, sir. Thanks for joining us for the Q&A. So we have a few questions that have come in, but if folks want to post their questions in the chat here in Zoom, if you're with us in Zoom, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can ask your questions there, and we will see how many of these we can get to.
All right. I'll keep my answer short.
Yeah. And also, I noticed, I just want to do a few shout outs. I don't know everyone. Some people are only in the chat by in the Zoom by first name. But I do see Ron Miller in the Zoom, and he's has a vested interest in this subject. And
yeah, I should say, I realized as I was watching that, I didn't mention Ron's name, but the Center for Free Thought Equality, I forgot the position he holds on it, if he's the director of it, but the Center for Free Thought Equality does a wonderful job of making endorsements for these candidates, and they've helped keep track of how many open atheists are running for, I think, state level, maybe even some city councils and higher.
Yeah, absolutely. And if any of you have run for office, definitely drop that in the chat. We'd love to hear from you about what that was like and what you learned. But let me go to the questions that have showed up in the chat during your presentation. Let's see. I believe it's Tim says, do you have any advice for politically engaged secular folks with fundamentalist Christian families or backgrounds? The families could aid in the opponent's disparaging message, which could be politically and personally damaging.
Right. So, I mean, if you come from a religious family, which is most atheists, I would gather, you understand them. You know where they're coming from. I think the message you want to get across, and this is the one that I've seen from a lot of the candidates who are vocal about it, about their atheism, they don't hide it, is mostly, yeah, I am an atheist, but I am not here to debate theology. I'm not here to advance my personal beliefs. That's not what government's for. I'm here to represent atheists.
Right.
I believe her name is escaping me at the moment, but there was a transgender candidate who won a statewide elected office a couple of years ago, and she beat a very anti-trans incumbent. And I think the day she got elected, they said, "What do you have to say to him? Do you want to kind of like metaphorically kick him while he's down or something right now?" And she basically said, "I wouldn't do that. He's one of my constituents now, and I represent him too." And that's the mentality here, which is there are people who want to, especially if you're not Christian. This applies to Muslims too. They do it to them all the time when they run for office, which is they want to pick a fight. They want to pick a religious fight, and that's not what you're there for. So in terms of trying to communicate that with a fundamentalist Christian, not just family, but community, it's the point that, look, I'm representing you. I want to bring your values to the table where we agree. In terms of like a family using that disparagingly, what I have found, and again, this depends on where you live, but when people try to use atheism against you as a candidate, more often than not, there's been a big backlash to that. Like, why are you going after this politician for that? Right. It's a bad reason. I'm not saying it wouldn't work in all places, but at least there are some situations where the insinuation, like this person, you can't trust them, they're an atheist. That's a hard thing politically for an opponent, because nowadays, in some parts of the country for sure, because who cares? I mean, we all have our religious differences, and I don't think it would work if you tried that with any other religion either. Like, don't vote for this person because that person is a blank. Like, go after their policies. That's fair game. The rest of that stuff, I mean, so, hey, you know what? If your religious family is going to come after you, if you have a good campaign going, you can flip that right back around too.
Yeah, that would be something to have your immediate family campaigning against you in an election. Ooh.
Yeah. That would be, and again, for a bad reason. It's one thing when someone knows you well and they're like, don't vote for this person because you can't trust them. But it's a different thing when they're saying, don't trust them, don't vote for them because that person holds different religious views. And that's kind of it. What are they going to do? What's an atheist going to do in office? Like, there are no churches forever. Like, come on.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Let's see. Could you talk a bit about how, well, you talked in your talk about how the Christian right is motivating their followers, practically rallying them to follow their movement. How can we secular students do the same or even better? How can we get lazy liberals and millennial non-voters to get them to vote for secular candidates?
So, well, first we need secular candidates. So that's the first hurdle right there. But how do you get young atheists, how do you get secular students, and more importantly, non-voters, how do you get them interested? this is what all those successful candidates have figured out how to do really well, which is talk about the things that matter to them. And it may be something that gets zero play on television or in like the news media. It's like, hey, you know that road outside your house that sucks? That's why I want to get into office, so we could fix that stuff. That makes a difference. It's getting them excited about the things that either matter to them and it seems like no one cares about, or it's focusing on the shared values that you all have. And if you're running for school board, so many people have a vested interest in making sure your school system is working and the kids are as educated as best they can. You focus on that and you tell them why this makes a difference, especially if the people you have in office right now are making it worse. I think it's one thing when I'm talking to this, like to the Secular Student Alliance and the sort of people who would watch this, we are probably all very politically engaged. And it seems kind of weird to even think there's so many people who never think about any of this stuff.
Right.
But that is true. Most people don't think about it because they have other things to do. They have a family and kids and work. So trying to convince them like this will make a tangible difference in your life. And here's how, and here's why I'm going to contribute to that. Focusing on that and just helping them realize that they can make a difference, especially if they're not happy with the way things are going, which is like literally everyone right now.
And
I'm not saying that's going to work on everybody, but hopefully that's a start.
Right. Yeah, and like you said a second ago, you know, the atheism per se doesn't really tell us much about your political values. I mean, an atheist could be anyone from, you know, someone like Richard Spencer all the way to, I don't know, some socialist or communist or something. So we don't really know much about your politics just by the fact that you're an atheist. So I think what you say about, you know, the importance of having something that you stand for politically and beginning to like refine that.
And it takes time and it takes a lot of practice to figure out how do you sell this message that for a lot of people may sound really boring. I mean, who wants to talk about the roads and, you know, city property taxes and stuff? It doesn't sound that exciting. And it takes a little work trying to convince people here, this is going to affect your pocketbook. This is going to affect your kids' schools. You should, I mean, I'm not asking you for anything else other than I need your vote for like 2 minutes on one day and it'll get better for you because that's why I want to do this.
We have a student from Missouri who wrote in a question from our YouTube broadcast. And I'm curious what you'll say. I think I know what you might say. He writes, I'm a Missouri resident and college student who finds difficulty with legislation that's often aimed at LGBTQ+ and religious minorities. Many of these bills claim to allow religious freedom, when in reality, they want to give religion the right to discriminate. How can I encourage my fellow religious peers that they should share these secular values, especially in extremely conservative states?
Who's the philosopher who once said, like, it's easy to think all those laws are awesome because they do benefit you, especially if you're a conservative Christian right now, and you hold those conservative Christian beliefs. But that's not always going to be the case. It's never the case that things stay the same forever. And just trying to convince them that, look, even if, what happens if you become a minority religious group? What happens, I mean, this is the thing, if you're younger, if you're a millennial, I mean, odds are you probably know a lot of people, even if you are in like a very conservative bubble, you probably know a lot of people who are Muslim, who are Hindu, who are non-religious, even if they're not atheists. Like, I think most people want to look out for everyone's best interests. And I think just trying to tell them, look, what if you're not in power? Don't you want religious liberties to protect everyone? Here's a level playing surface. It doesn't matter what you believe on this one, because no one's stopping your church from believing what you want. No one's trying to get in the way of that. And I know, because I cover this all the time, I know they often use those fear tactics of, you know, if this person gets in office, they're going to take away your right to worship. I'm seeing that right now. And I'm just, my knee-jerk response is, do they know Biden is like a devout Catholic? He's not interested in closing down the churches. But this is the thing across no matter the office. It's like, what do atheists want if they get power? it's not shutting down churches. I mean, all the atheist groups that fight this sort of thing, that's never on their agenda, I promise you. Whereas the emails I get from Christian right groups are very much, if this person, who by the way happens to be religious but is not politically on our side, gets in office, they will, destroy your right to go to worship services. I mean,
Yeah,
it's just trying to convince people to have empathy for people who are not like them. I have said this before, like, it's really hard to teach people why they should be kind if they're not already, but that's kind of it. We're not asking for special treatment, but the government should be on an equal playing field when it comes to religion, and then make your best case. Go persuade people. No one's stopping you.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like lessons that you should have learned in first grade about
right.
being nice to people and playing nice with others. And
and the golden rule. I mean, isn't that what we want the government to be doing? Just we want you to treat all groups as if they are not in the majority or the minority. Like, give them the equal playing field, and then we'll see what happens from there. And unfortunately, it seems like so much of the legislation, especially in conservative areas, is designed to keep like conservative Christians up and everyone else down.
And like you said a minute ago too, I think the media tends to amplify these, outrage cases, and the reality is more and more people are, we have more Muslims elected to public office than ever before. We have a progressive secular caucus in the Congress. We're going to be speaking with the co-founders of that in tomorrow's day, during the conference tomorrow. So it is beginning to change. And I think these outlier cases where, people want to claim that it's a kind of ploy to take away their rights. I know in the heartland where this student's writing from in Missouri, it's a serious problem still, but maybe they can run for office, when the time comes and begin to change that themselves.
I know everyone says this all the time, but the demographics are still shifting in the direction of being non-religious. And I'm not saying that means they're all atheists, but it means I think more young people understand that everyone around them doesn't share the same religious values, and that when you're writing legislation, like, it doesn't help when it's only promoting kind of one belief system.
Yeah, your 77% number was really shocking. I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah, huge. I mean, I was shocked when I saw that too. And again, that was January. That's well before this campaign, the presidential campaign, kicks into like really high gear.
Right.
And again, I think one of the consequences we're going to see in this presidential election, because conservative Christians are so heavily tied to one candidate, is that if he's not doing well, they're not doing well. It's pushing more people away from them. It'll be, we won't feel that for a few years down the line, but.
Yeah. A couple more questions came in. This is from Evan in California. He writes, there are even secular professional consultants now, like Henry Consulting with Sarah Henry, Secular Strategies with Sarah Levin, and Spectrum Experience run by Sarah Blaine, that would love to help folks run for office. Can you talk a bit about some of the campaigns and organizations that have been trailblazing in this area, and other ways that you can support campaigns and candidates even if you don't run for office?
Yeah. Oh my God, I'm trying to think of the name. Ryan, maybe you can help me out, but there was a candidate in Arizona a few years ago who ran for Congress because it was an unopposed seat, but he was a blind candidate who was a fantastic progressive candidate on that list. But I believe Sarah's and Evan Clark's group, maybe that was Spectrum, was helping out with his candidacy. And one of the things they did is it was such a heavily red district that other Democrats had kind of written it off. And here's a guy who's presenting himself as, look, let me tell you why you should get out to vote, even if you agree with me and you think it's a lost cause, you should still vote for me. They helped him craft that campaign. I saw them do some amazing things with it. One of the things that I really still remember today is there was a questionnaire some groups sent out. What do you think about comprehensive sex ed or affordable healthcare or contraception or something like that? And the incumbent Republicans said, I oppose all of this stuff. Or maybe it was a Planned Parenthood thing too. And this candidate, with their help, basically wrote back and designed condoms with his name on it. And basically they put it to the questionnaire saying, no, we fully support access to contraception and comprehensive education on this matter. And that the way they did it was clever. And they knew this was a controversial issue in that district. And they made sure it got a lot of attention in the process. But this is what having a good team of consultants can do, especially when they know you're an atheist and they know this is a clear difference you can make. Sometimes it helps to play it up, especially if you're in a very conservative area where it's like, listen, it's going to be a hard race. You might as well. Sky's the limit. Go for it. Push those boundaries. Whereas if you're in a very tight race, you want to tone it down or something. But the fact that there are more people running for office who are non-religious and openly so, and the fact that there are people who specialize in helping those people, how amazing is that?
I know. Yeah, I would just say I actually ran for city council in this last election in 2019 here in my city of Pasadena. And one of the things I would say too is even if you're not sure you want to run for office, it takes time to build a campaign.
Yes.
People start 2, 3, 4 years ahead thinking about what they'll do. And I think it's so important, especially in local campaigns. People want to know who you are, that you've been involved, that you're not a carpetbagger. And so I think it's really a good idea to find something that you're passionate about and start going to meetings, start going to city council meetings, start going to school board meetings, and become familiar with the issues, because when you run, you're going to be expected to off the cuff speak to those issues intelligently. And if you're trying to learn on the fly, it'll be pretty obvious. And I started way too late, even though I was pretty familiar, but it can take years to really catch up. Read your local newspaper, as bad as it may be. I subscribe now to my local paper.
I cannot agree with you enough on that. And I think what you said there is so important, especially for the I'm putting big quote hands here, big for the winnable races.
Right.
But city council, school board, there are so few people. I've for my blog, I sometimes see the live streams of these things because there's some issue I'm trying to track. And you could see it's like 4 people are watching this live stream and like it's been viewed all of 30 times, like 3 days later. No one's paying attention. And that's scary. So if you're running for those offices, you're right. It starts early, but it also starts by you watching your city council. What are they doing at their meetings? What are they talking about? And you got to have some context for the issues that they're discussing. Because like I have heard this from people, like they get very passionate about social issues that kind of come up in the media that we talk about online. And it's like, you're running for city council. Those things literally have very little play in what you're running. Why would you care about that stuff when there's these more pressing issues locally? And it's because they don't pay attention to what's happening.
Especially the culture war issues, but like environmentalism, the police that we're all talking about now, segregation, inequality coming down, like jobs, school education, inequality in education. All these issues are super relevant. Well, we're running out of time, but I have one last question posed by Christina on the Zoom chat. And she says, I'm curious, Hemant, if you're thinking about running for office anytime soon.
Listen, I've spent 15 years. Thanks. I've spent 15 years writing opposition material for myself. Like anyone who ever runs against me can go back to like yesterday and they'll be like, here, this disqualifying. I honestly think I'm happier and I'm better off when I can support candidates. I mean, I work as a public school coach for a team as well. And I love that role. I like being behind the scenes and other people taking kind of the spotlight. I enjoy that a lot more. So this is part of why I wanted to give this talk. I want other people to run. I want to cheer you on from the sidelines. I think I'm better off that way too. But I don't think that is a hypocritical thing I am saying. I think that's where my talent is. It's being behind the scenes. Like my dream job right now would be like a speechwriter for one of these people. That would be awesome.
That would be fun.
But again, that's not me saying, do it. I'm not going to do it. That's just, I think I know where my talents are and it's not on that side of the fence.
Right.
But I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I hope folks are seriously considering whether hopefully our secular students, whether your education is, regardless of what your educational position in your school, the degree that you're seeking, we need all different types, like Hemant was saying. Some of our most popular politicians now have started not as lawyers, as so many of them do, but in other fields. So,
and they're really good at it too.
Yeah,
like when you
really
see them
good.
when they get elected, and it's always a big deal because they come from non-traditional backgrounds, and then you watch them in action, it's like, oh, you're really good at this. Yeah, why wouldn't they be? Like, what made you think they wouldn't be good? I'm just like, AOC was a bartender, and then she goes to the meetings and like asks them questions that go viral. It's like, why do you think she couldn't do that? You know what I mean? But that applies to anybody. You don't need the Harvard education necessarily. You don't need money necessarily. You can do it.
Yeah, you can do it. Well, that's a good place for us to stop. We have Sarah Lazar coming up in 15 minutes, the president and CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And so I hope you'll join us for that in a few minutes. Thank you so much, Hemant, for your presentation. It was amazing. For being here live for the Q&A is so helpful. And we'll see you down the road.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.